Thank you so much for the invitation, Christiana, and your team. What an amazing experience it's been. I've only been here a few days. My only regret is that I didn't come last week and spend more time with you. It's just incredible to learn more about your projects and your work. Grateful to be visiting on Indigenous territory here in Brazil. I am as Christiana mentioned, I'm living, working in the Alberta region of Canada, in Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Métis territory. So I wanted to acknowledge that I'm a settler, scholar, and ally in support of Indigenous peoples, both in my region and in many others through the Arramat project. So again, it's an honor to be here. I'm going to talk about the Arramat project, which is something I've been living, breathing, sleeping for many years now, and offer some lessons learned as well as some reflections on transdisciplinarity, on transformation, and give you maybe some insights and tools to think about how to build your own proposals, because my understanding from Chris is that you're working on your own proposals or thinking about how you translate what you've learned here into other kinds of work, into other kinds of research activities. So I want to start out by giving you a sense. Arramat is a Temashek word from the Tuareg people from Mali, from the Sahel-Sahara region. I'm the principal investigator, nominated principal investigator of the Arramat project, but I am really just one of many people leading the projects and engaged in the project. So I want to acknowledge Mariam Wale Boubakrine, who's not here with us today. She's actually at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, talking about the Arramat project. Also, Dana Kabili Littlechild, Sherry Pictou, Murray Humphreys from McGill University, John O'Neill. So the six of us are the leads of the project, and there are many, many others who I'll talk a little bit about this morning. The focus of Arramat is on the interconnections between biodiversity and Indigenous health and well-being. So we're unpacking what do we mean by health, what do we mean by biodiversity through the project, and understanding, building evidence about those interconnections between biodiversity and health and well-being. So not work on biodiversity in and of itself, but thinking about that transformation. We know that Indigenous communities in so many parts of the world struggle, as Eduardo pointed out, with many kinds of stresses in their communities on their health and well-being. No matter the indicator that you use, certainly in Canada and many other places, Indigenous peoples face some of the worst health outcomes of any communities globally. So our work is really trying to explore how the environment, how the land matters to health and well-being. And we started off our process building this proposal in 2019, inspired by words of Cree elder from northern Quebec, who said in some of the research he was doing with Naomi Adelson, if the land is not healthy, how can we be? And so this holistic sense of the land and people and the health of people are interconnected is fundamental to the project. And that conceptual framework, which emerges from many Indigenous cultures and languages, is maybe considered within the academic silos we usually work in, the academic institutions, the funding agencies we get support from, as very transformative, very transdisciplinarity. And this is a concept, of course, that is fundamental to this whole process and our learning together. But it's not new in many Indigenous communities. And so we're starting with the recognition that the expertise around transdisciplinarity doesn't rest in geography or doesn't rest in ecology, but rests in communities. It emerges from communities that live, that breathe, that smell, that taste, that experience the land in ways that are fundamental to their health and well-being. So there are many definitions of transdisciplinarity, and I'm sure you've batted around a lot of them over the last 8 days, 9 days. What wanted to bring forward here, though, is not just transdisciplinarity for its own sake, but the sense of transdisciplinary justice. So why are we doing this work? Why are we thinking about crossing boundaries, addressing barriers between disciplines, cultures, communities, territories? And some of the starting points in building the proposal came from Indigenous communities in Canada who I'd been working with for the last now 30 years in northern Canada, in Dene, Denisothlina, Inuit, Inuvialuit territories. And there's recognition that a lot of the knowledge that informs decision-making at local, regional, national, and global scales is science, quote-unquote, Western science. And there's tremendous inequities in terms of our decisions and the basic reality of whose knowledge matters, what constitutes evidence. And so we're really trying to push back against that inequity, or address that inequity, to ensure that Indigenous organizations have the resources, have the opportunities, the capacity to do their own work, to tell their own stories, to build their own evidence. And that is not something that it is, again, doing that work for its own sake, or in a kind of conceptual, abstract sense, but because that kind of work can improve or address some of the fundamental challenges they're having in their own communities. So we wanted, through the Arramat project, to be able to not just produce evidence, but also identify innovations and actionable solutions. So some of this language comes from the Indigenous organizations directly who helped build the proposal. So I'll talk a little bit about the development of the proposal, because Chris asked me to, and it's a bit of therapy as well, because of course, transdisciplinary, if you work in your own space, in your own silo, that's relatively easy. You start trying to understand other disciplines, spending time learning from other people, from across cultural boundaries, across political borders. That's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to be able to create those kinds of networks in which everybody feels safe, which everyone feels like they're welcome, that their knowledge matters. So with our project beginning in 2019, this funding opportunity emerged in Canada, which is one of the larger grants that's available in Canada. And I was working with a small group of Indigenous communities at the time. We had a project on watershed governance in the Mackenzie River watershed, which is one of Canada's largest watersheds. Also a collaboration here in Brazil with Renato Silvano from Porto Alegre. He has been working, some of you may know Renato, who's lovely, been working for many years in the Tapajós and Trompetas river basin, and we also had a connection in Thailand in the lower Mekong to learn more from Indigenous and local communities about watershed governance. We ran out of money. We had a great project, 6 years long. Darn, we ran out of money. What do we do? So we looked at the opportunity that emerged in Canada through our national funding agency, the Tri-Council, and they had a call for proposals for $24 million over 6 years. And we thought, gee, that's a ridiculously large opportunity. We're probably not going to be able to succeed. It was a new opportunity. We thought, well, why don't we just get together? We start learning from one another. We think about the process of building the proposal as the innovation or as the success in and of itself. So it was during COVID also, where we started with a small group of people in Canada and continued to build relationships with other communities through our networks, so that by the time we submitted the proposal, we had 150 Indigenous organizations, governments, co-management boards, Indigenous scholars involved in the project, as well as non-Indigenous scholars. I think we counted, it was probably 300 to 400 hours of Zoom meetings between 2019 and 2021, where people just, we had a sort of webinar series where people told their own stories, shared their own knowledge, and then we 2 or 3 days later, we'd have another webinar, and we'd learn from Maria Eugenia from Bolivia, Prasert from the PASD communities in northern Thailand, from the Maori in New Zealand, from the Inuit in northern Canada. And people were really excited about that opportunity, and so it sounds like it was kind of engineered a little bit, but it really was making friends. It was really about learning and starting to care about other people, other places, and finding that resonance with communities all over the world. So dear colleague Leon Andrew from the Satu region, he's a Dene elder from northern Canada, was so excited when he met Alejandro Aramido from Peru, where they shared knowledge and reflected together on what it was like to live in the mountains, what mountains meant to them, how they built their livelihoods around mountain ecosystems. And so it was this kind of connectivity, relationship building that I think was the real power of the process of building the proposal. So we didn't really look at the proposal as a sort of a means to an end, but as a gift in and of itself. So we were pleasantly surprised that when we did get the funding, that we said, wow, this is great. We can continue building these relationships and learning together. And you can see roughly from the map, and Chris mentioned, we're a large network and working in 70 different eco-zones, eco-regions. I think we're at 31 different countries now and 150 Indigenous governments and organizations. And the structure of the funding, it's a lot of funding, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The structure of the funding is, it's a university sourced funding opportunity. So the funding has to come to a Canadian university. It's a Canadian funding agency. But our project was innovative and perhaps that's partly why we were successful, in that we turned upside down the conventional approach to academic research. So in conventional academic research, I get the grant, I decide, what kinds of communities or where I want to work, who gets involved, who doesn't get involved, the methodology. I am involved in structuring, how that research contributes to different kinds of outcomes. So that kind of model that we've all benefited from as academics is very powerful because it produces incredible kinds of knowledge that can address some of these same issues. But the power dynamics are when we think about participatory action research methodologies and principles of collaborative research, if the funding always stays within universities and communities have to adapt to fit the university bureaucracy, the university administrative model, that really limits or constrains how people do their work. And also, the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, what we know from UNDRIP, from other kinds of other kinds of frameworks, like in Canada we have ownership, control, access, and possession of data as a framework. That really constrains how Indigenous people participate. So our funding model was upside down, and the financial administration at the University of Alberta will tell you how stressful that is for them. I have good friends now in the finance and administration offices. So our over half the money, $9 million of our funding goes directly to Indigenous organizations, communities, that's women's co-ops, that's advocacy organizations in northern Thailand, that's refugee camp NGOs in Burkina Faso, incredibly powerful organizations that we know have the knowledge, have the skills, have the expertise to tell their own stories. And by providing them the funding directly, they can say, okay, we have the funding now, we know what we want to do. We'd like to work with Christiana Seixas, who's going to help us learn more about particular kinds of ethnobiology models. We're going to work with Murray Humphreys from McGill, who knows a lot about wildlife disease and biology, so that's going to be handy. We're going to work with Fikret Burkus, who knows a lot about watershed and small-scale fisheries. And so it puts the power in the hands of communities to make those decisions directly. And that's very uncomfortable for a lot of academics, including myself, right? That doesn't feel good when you're like, oh, well, I guess I just have to wait in my office till somebody calls, and you kind of get the sense of, gee, I guess that's how communities feel, right? If sort of just sitting and waiting, hoping that academic comes walking by or driving to town. And so that has really been, I think, a game changer in how we've built the network, where communities don't feel like they're just participants in a process that's been already designed. So our structure, we have many projects, and I don't have time to talk about them all, but we're able to fund over 150 Indigenous-led projects. We're in year 3 of the project now, and we've funded 70. And the work is amazing, just amazing to see the kinds of things people are doing. And in addition to that kind of arrangement, which I'll talk about more in a minute, it's important to recognize that the leadership team of the whole Arramat project, over 50% of our leadership team is Indigenous. So at the PI level, Miriam, Sherry, Danica, Billy Littlechild are Indigenous. We also have a second sort of tier of leadership, which we call transformation working groups or global transformation pathway teams. Some of this language we had to kind of think, what's sexy to the funding agency? We want to sound, we came up with some of these acronyms so we could, try and capture the attention of some of the funding agencies. Coming up with something like global transformation pathway teams sounds very Star Trek or very impressive. But really they're working groups of people getting together and learning from one another. Each of those working groups is co-led by an Indigenous person. So of the 10 working groups, we have 27 leads. Over 70% of those co-leads are Indigenous. And all the projects that we're funding are Indigenous-led. So it's a different kind of model that's created a lot of stress for administration at the University of Alberta. But they, as my colleague in the President's office noted, some of the transformation that we're able to achieve through the project is really administrative. So as academics, we come up with a lot of impressive principles and abstract ideas about how we're going to do work and how it's going to inform decision-making. But we really know that at the end of the day, unless the finance clerk is going to process the honoraria form for the Indigenous elder who participated in your meeting, everything stops dead. That we need to think about administrative transformation at the same time we're thinking about some of these bigger ideas. I think the other interesting thing to touch on is, and I mentioned already, free, prior, and informed consent, and some of the principles associated with Indigenous data sovereignty. Sort of what's really emerging as interesting to me is, the models of free, prior, and informed consent as a non-Indigenous person. If I want to invite Elson into my project, where is Elson? There he is. Say, Elson, do you want to participate in my project? And I can give you information about the project, make sure you're informed. You decide you're going to give consent. That process, though, is really directed from a kind of top-down perspective. What does free, prior, and informed consent mean when it's all Indigenous people saying, well, as an Indigenous leader, I'm engaging with elders and youth in my own community. Do I need to fill out these forms around free, prior, and informed consent? What does that look like? So what we're trying to do, and it's actually been really a fascinating process, is working with a number of case studies right now to think about what are the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty that matter in Thailand. What does Indigenous data sovereignty look like in Bolivia, in the Cherokee territory in the United States, or in Inuit territory? And sort of building from the ground up a different kind of plan and set of principles around Indigenous data sovereignty, rather than just slapping down the kind of boilerplate kind of consent forms that the universities have, for example, for consent. So that's kind of emergent as well as far as the project goes. I'm going to share a little bit of, or a little perspective on some of the projects, but just to give you a sense of also the structure of how we did the work. So as I mentioned, as we're building the proposal, people are volunteering their time, telling their stories, sharing their ideas about how the project should go. What are some of the key themes? What are some of the key issues? And people volunteered their time. We didn't have a lot of funding to be able to support the process. So what does that mean if once we get the funding, how do we honor the work that people have done, that honor the time that people have shared into developing the proposal process? So what we did was say, okay, well, Maria Eugenia from the Aymaran Cooperative in Bolivia, Maria Eugenia contributed so much time. We make sure that when we get the funding, if we get the funding, there's an allocation for an Indigenous place-based project that has Maria Eugenia's name on it. We had, Herb Nakamayak from the Inuvialuit settlement region. Herb put a lot of time in, the Inuvialuit did, making sure the Inuvialuit have an allocation for funding. So we tried to honor and respect the time that people had given to the proposal development process by creating a budget structure for the place-based projects, for the Indigenous-led projects, so that when we did get the funding, we essentially already had a sense of what those, who was going to do the work or who was going to benefit from that funding. So some large grants in Canada, you get a large amount of funding, you create an open call for proposals, and then it's kind of like a free-for-all in terms of who's going to get that money, and it doesn't necessarily honor the work that people put into the proposal. So I really think that process, or that recognition of people's time in how we distributed the funding was critical. But it wasn't just writing a check and saying good luck with the project. We created a strategic RFP, request for proposals, and an application form, not a bureaucratic one, but one that had enough details about the project that we knew, or we could recognize that work was going to address the fundamental objectives of the project around biodiversity and Indigenous health. And we also have a kind of peer review process where For example, Alejandro Aramido submitted a proposal for work on the potato park in Peru. 2 other Indigenous people who also got place-based project funding review Alejandro's proposal and say, oh, that's a great project, Alejandro. Have you thought of doing this? Have you thought of using video? Have you thought of perhaps connecting with people in Thailand who are also doing small-scale agriculture that you could learn from other work going on? So we're trying to create more learning in the process of the proposal development structure, so that it's also horizontal, so it's not just the university making decisions about who gets funded and who doesn't, but it's other Indigenous communities who are also receiving funding as part of the network. So we have 2 phases of funding going out. The first 70 projects have been funded, and then in year 4 and 5 we have another 75 to 80 projects that we're hoping to fund. I'm going to ask if Ariana could help me share some. I'll just maybe 1 second to point out that 70 projects don't have time to of course share much in the way of detail about any of them, and it's important that the Indigenous organizations tell their own stories about their own projects, their own work. And what we've started doing is on our website, each of the people who receive funding is making a short video statement about their work, why it's important to their organization, some of the key outcomes that they're finding already. What I'm going to highlight here is a project that was funded in the Inuvialuit region. A very strong focus of all the projects is on youth engagement and capacity building, mentorship of young people. Indigenous people are so poorly represented in post-secondary institutions. The funding model we have in Canada, that you must fund HQP, you must fund graduate students, is very important. But that doesn't necessarily contribute to capacity within in Indigenous communities. So our HQP model is about funding people in community as trainees, receiving mentorship not only from academics, but their elders, their own community members. And this project, which Chris can tell me if I'm out of time, is a short project in the Inuvialuit region. While they're setting this up, I'll just tell you the Inuvialuit region is the western Inuit region of Canada, which is one of 7 Indigenous or Inuit territories in northern Canada. The Inuvialuit depend heavily on marine ecosystems for their livelihoods, health and well-being. As a result of climate change and a number of other stresses, one of the main sources of food people have, which is beluga whale, is under threat from large-scale cruise ship tourism coming through the Northwest Passage, and also nasty things like microplastics, mercury, and other kinds of long-range contaminants in the ecosystem. And so I've been working in the Inuvialuit region since 2001. And the video that you're going to see is one that one of my grad students was involved in, supporting the Inuvialuit youth to tell their own stories about beluga whale harvesting, why it's important to them, and also talk a little bit about the cooperation they're having with Department of Fisheries and Oceans scientists who, in that kind of model of co-production, being able to produce data about the key question, are whales safe to eat? Kyle Cockney, Natalie Noxana, incredibly inspirational young people wanting to tell their own stories, working side by side with colleagues like Lisa Lassetto, who's a biologist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. This is actually a picture of the Inuvialuit youth who traveled along with youth from a Dene community, another Indigenous community in northern Canada, as well as Cree from Alberta, and they went to the Food and Agriculture Organization the UN Symposium, Indigenous Youth Symposium in Rome in November, and presented their film to great applause from other youth from around the world. And it just elevated their sense that their story was important, is important in terms of thinking about themes of food security, and that their capacity to do their own work is incredibly important. On our website, there's many other short videos that you can watch. This is just to highlight Maria Eugenia again, Choque from Bolivia, doing incredible work with Aymaran women. On food security, an incredible project in India, Vincent Eka with the Indian Social Institute and tribal peoples in India, and then Jesse Pop from the University of Guelph. So you get a sense from just these clips here, we're funding a diversity of different kinds of organizations. The Women's Cooperative, Youth and the Hunters Trappers Organization, Indigenous scholars directly, as well as advocacy organizations such as the Forest Peoples Group in India. Next, oops. So the exciting thing is that, of course, Indigenous organizations doing their own work in their own places, in their own communities, in their own territories. But people, to a certain extent, have been doing that work already. In many other cases, this is all new. So one of I think the innovations that we have at the University of Alberta is kind of created ethical administrative relationships, or what we called ethical space in financial administration at the University of Alberta. It takes a long time to figure out how to move money. I know I've tried to move money to Brazil before, and it's incredibly difficult. To organizations who've never received university funding, the sort of requirements, administrative requirements are significant. So we've really had to do some education within the university system itself about how to work ethically, respectfully with organizations that have not necessarily a good sense of how the university system works. So that kind of administration, mentioned already, very important. Communities doing research in their own regions, the value added from the project for many people is not just to receive the funding to do their own work, but to learn from others, to collaborate together and bring the evidence together in support of policy change, in support of different kinds of health outcomes or biodiversity outcomes. So there are 10 working groups that we have, are the Global Transformation Pathway teams. And just a glimpse of some of them: strengthening food sovereignty, Indigenous food sovereignty, land back movements, respecting Indigenous territories, sustainable Indigenous economies, the decolonization of science and education, nurturing traditional medicines and healthcare, healing physical, spiritual relationships to nature. So these are just some of the themes of the working groups where, similar to what we did with the proposal development process, people from Maori territory, from India, from Inuit territory, getting together on Zoom, the magic of Zoom, to share outcomes of their research and say, okay, well, how can we bring this, how can we synthesize the evidence that we've produced in our different territories together in a way that's going to have some kind of policy impact, whether nationally or internationally. And that policy change, there's different models, and Eduardo is probably far better able to speak to how policy change happens. We're just exploring what it means in the context of our project. But rather than, as my colleague Krista says, throwing reports over the fence at the end of the project and hoping someone reads them, like our theses, right, from our PhD. Hope somebody reads this, maybe someday. What we're doing through the process is engaging, particularly at the global level, UN agencies and others as part of the working group. So FAO, for example, incredible people there, WHO, the World Health Organization, involved. In Canada, we have Environment Canada, the Indigenous Affairs agencies. Some governments are very, very interested in helping, supporting, amplifying the work that's going on. And in other cases, governments are really not interested. And so we have this sort of mix of friends and allies within these policy circles, and then people that just don't want to hear anything about it. And so I was saying earlier that the present government in my region, my province of Alberta, is very Donald Trump-esque. And you know, some of the biggest fights I think we have, you know, are with governments who are yeah, very much like the provincial government I have in Alberta. So, you know, at a bare minimum, think about policy change. And Eduardo talked wonderfully about the work that's going on with IPBES. Mentioned earlier, you know, there's an inequity in terms of the evidence that's available in the scientific literature, where Indigenous knowledge is not well documented for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Indigenous people do not get funding to do their own work in many cases. So what we're trying to do is kind of find that, address that inequity by ensuring that the local communities receiving funding, Indigenous communities, are producing their own kinds of reports, and that we're also supporting in different ways people to engage in academic writing as well. So at a bare minimum, perhaps policy change comes from just saying, here's a report that we did about the value of biodiversity to health in 20 different countries. Cannot affect policy change? Maybe not. What other kinds of discussion, what other kinds of learning needs to happen within institutions so that we create that transformation, not only in the kinds of data that we extract and pull into different policy decision making, but in terms of the system of who gets to make decisions, who's involved, and perhaps catalyze new kinds of processes of decision making in different political domains. So I'll maybe leave it there. I have a number of questions, though, for those of you who are working on proposals. Some lessons learned from our proposal development process, which I can touch on briefly, that may be useful to you, those of you who are working on proposals. Thinking about, you know, the planning process, as Eduardo already mentioned, you know, getting people involved early, being critically important. But I think that the lessons learned from our process is also that sort of meaningful process of learning going on from the early stages of proposal development, where people care about one another, they care about the issues, they're learning from one another, and that the proposal development process is of value, and that you can feel good about, even if the funding doesn't work out, that you can feel good about the process and say, we did something wonderful together. You know, structure and staffing in a project this size is incredibly important. And you know, I think I touched on already a lot of the administrative and governance issues. I think one of the challenges we have at this stage moving forward is thinking about data management, which is another big motherhood sort of statement about what happens to the knowledge that emerges from the projects. Communities control their own data, but how do we meaningfully, respectfully synthesize outcomes, and what happens to the data 10 years out, 20 years out? How can we build a legacy from the project and ensure that the knowledge isn't lost? As far as developing your projects, I just have these little slides that may be useful to think about. You know, what is transformation in the context of the work that you're proposing, that you're doing? How could the project be transformational? And that kind of transformation is not only in outcomes and saying, we're going to produce new knowledge that's transformational, but think about the structure and the process of how you're going to do the work. That the end product is only part of the story. And so I urge you to think a little bit about that in terms of your proposals. Also, in Canada, and this funding agency call for proposals or criteria that they use to judge proposals. They talk about high risk, high reward. Where does your project fit on that kind of risk level, reward level? So Chris and I were talking a little bit about this yesterday. Some of the stereotypes we have about Indigenous people doing their own work, gosh, that sounds terribly risky, that people may or may not do what they said they were going to do with the money. From a sort of status quo funding agency perspective, funding the University of Alberta, funding McGill University is far more comforting. But the sort of the bigger picture ideas about what's transformational in terms of research, finding ways to fund high risk work in a way that's going to have high impact. So, for example, I was just in Uganda working, we have a project with the Batwa in southern Uganda, very marginalized community. I can tell you a story, it's just a very emotional experience spending time there. The kind of funding that we're able to provide, the support to the Batwa there, they're overwhelmed and so excited about the opportunity to collaborate in the project. Very high risk though, since those communities haven't received this kind of funding before. But the reward is going to be from the, that's the university language, the reward is significant. So we have kind of a range in the 150 projects we're funding. Probably 30 to 40% are in very high risk kind of environments and institutions like the MR and Women's Cooperative never received money from the University of Alberta, let alone any Canadian university. That's possibly very risky that the university would send funding there. But Maria Eugenia is an incredible person, incredible scholar, incredible activist, and already producing incredible things for the project. And so when you think about what is transformational, not status quo kind of arrangements administratively or in terms of research team structure, but looking at very high risk kinds of scenarios. Feasibility of the project. And some of these criteria, feasibility, high impact, high reward, transformational, these were the criteria that the funding agency asked us to justify in our proposal. How feasible is it that you're going to be able to do this? We can come up with wild and crazy ideas about transformation. How's that actually going to work? I don't know how many people have been on funding agency adjudication committees, but methodology, feasibility is huge. You can have wonderful ideas, but if you can't articulate your methods, you can't articulate how you're going to do the work, and really justify, I have the right people, we have the right approach here, your funding proposal is likely to suffer. So feasibility is huge. How are you going to do it? And sometimes when I'm guiding my graduate students in writing proposals, think about 10% to 20% of your proposal should be background information. 50% should be about methods, your approach, your methods, how you're going to do the work, and the rest sort of justifying what you think are going to be the anticipated outcomes. So really the emphasis on research methods. So I'll close here with just these suggested themes or issues that you may want to think about, of course, in your proposals. They're hypothetical, some of them maybe not hypothetical. They're projects that are going to go on to do great things. I'm just so excited about this room, the energy that you all have, the students. It's very inspiring to be in a room with all of you and think about the great work you're already doing, but also how the networks that you're developing here, the friendships, the collaboration, the knowledge, the skills that you're developing here are going to be transformational in the work that you're going to do moving forward. So thank you again for your time, and wanted to again give thanks to the incredible people that I'm working with in the Arramat project. I'm just one of hundreds of people that are doing the work, and I get to stand up here with you and learn from you. So very, very grateful.